So in the last lesson I gave you a project which was to create a timer with a start, stop and reset function, and I'll show you how to do that in this lesson. So I've put some text on the stage and I've given it an instance name, timer text. I've also created some buttons which I've also given instance names, and in the action script window actions, I've copied over the action script from the last lesson that I gave you to show a demo. Before I go through that, I'll just quickly mention that these import statements that appear automatically are simply to allow me to use the objects that I've referred to later in the code. So this line here is setting up the timer. You will remember from the lesson on variables that the vast majority of variable objects in Flash require this new syntax, new timer in this case, and in parentheses I've put in a timer delay, in this case 1000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. The 0 means that the timer should continue in perpetuity. If I had put another number in there, say for example a 5, it would continue for 5 cycles before stopping. And I got that information out of the live docs. I've got timer up here. I scrolled down to find the constructor which has the same name as the object I'm using. It tells me how to create the object. I clicked on it and I read this information and I found out that the delay refers to milliseconds and the repeat count refers to how many times the timer cycles. I can also use LiveDocs to look at the functions, one of which is the start function, which starts the timer. I've also added an event listener. Events are also referred to in LiveDocs. In this case it's a timer event, and when I've started the timer, this function will be executed every 1 second in this case, because that's the delay that I've set. So every second this code will tell the trace function to write it works. Let's control test to make sure it does. So every second that's being written onto the screen. When I was creating the guess the number application, the first thing I did was to add event listeners to the buttons. I'm going to do the same thing here. In fact, I already have done. To save myself writing it out, I've just created mouse event listeners and linked them to those 3 buttons, the start, stop and reset buttons. I've also created functions, so when each of these is clicked on, the corresponding functions will be executed. So I want the timer to start when I hit the start button. So at the moment the timer.start is in the wrong place, so I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to put it in the start function. I'm also going to add a stop and a reset. So now when I control test, I shouldn't see it tracing it works until I click the start button, and then it should say it works every second until I click on stop. And the reason for that is because the buttons are now controlling when the timer starts, stops and resets. And that controls when the timer events can be created every second, and that means that this function will be running when the timer is started. But of course I don't want it to say it works every second. I want it to increment a number in this text box. Although before I increment a number in a text box, because a text box contains a string, I really need to be working with an integer. So I'm going to create an integer. In fact, I'm going to create two integers because there are two numbers in this text field. There's a seconds and there's minutes, and I'm going to treat those separately. So I'm going to create separate integer variables. Let's call them minutes and seconds. And when the onTimer function is called, I'm going to increment seconds first of all. I'll just show you that happening with the trace. So I'm incrementing seconds. So when I hit the start button, seconds is incrementing by 1. And by the way, ++ means to increment by 1 each time. It's exactly the same as writing +=1, which is also the same as writing seconds equals seconds plus 1. But for short, I'm going to write ++. You could also write --— if you wanted to subtract 1 every time. Of course, I don't want seconds to be counted all the way up to 60 and more. Every time it gets to 60, I want it to reset back to 0, and also increment the minutes by 1. I'm going to use an if statement to write that in computer code. If it's greater than or equal to 60, I want it to be set to 0, and I want the minutes to increment by 1. So again, we can trace seconds. I'm just creating a concatenated string here in the trace function, which will show both of them. And I'm going to start my seconds at 55 rather than 0, so that it's clearer that the minutes increment. So I'm going to go control test. I'm going to click start. Seconds going 56. And you can see the seconds went to 0 after 59, and the minutes have increased to 1, which is what I want it to do. So let's set that back to 0 again. Of course, I don't just want it to be in the trace, I want it to be here. I want the seconds and the minutes to be registered in this timer text. So let's set that up. Timer text.text to refer to the text property equals, and I'm going to put minutes first, then I'm going to concatenate the colon, and then I'm going to put seconds in. Let's see what happens when I do that. I press start. Now you can see it's not looking quite right there. There's no leading 0 when the number is below 10. So to fix that, I'm going to have to put in another if statement. So if seconds is less than 10, or if seconds is more than 10, I want something different to happen. So if seconds is less than 10, I want a leading 0. If it's more than 10, I don't. So let's see that happening. Let's set my seconds a bit higher, so it's clear that it works. When I click start, starting on the 6 there, you can see the leading 0 is working. Let's put that back to 0 again. I also don't want to do the same with minutes, but it's quite difficult to do them both at the same time, unless you're going to add in nested if statements. So that's one way of doing it. I could put in another if statement, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. I'm going to create a timer string, and I'm going to gradually build up the string each time. So I'm going to add minutes to the timer string first, and then I'm going to add on seconds to the timer string afterwards. So let's put if minutes is less than 10, timer string is going to be 0 plus, let's cast it. I don't actually need to cast it in this case because the context, I've included a string there and added a string addition, a concatenation, so I could leave the casting out because there's a context. The context will cause automatic casting. But in this next one I'm going to have to use the cast. It would create an error otherwise. So if minutes are less than 10, I'm going to include a leading 0. Then for the seconds I'm going to then add to the timer string. So I'm going to say timer string equals timer string plus, so that's including what is already in the timer string. I could also use plus equals as a shorthand. I'm going to include that part of it, and I'm going to make the timer text on the stage equal to timer string. I'll do the same in the else, but without the leading 0 in the seconds. So if I now go control test, it should work, although we can't tell yet because we're at an unsuitable set of values. Let's go to a more suitable one. Let's start at 9:55. It's got 9:56, got the leading 0 there in the minutes, and you can see that's working properly, and this is also working properly. So the timer string gradually adding to it is working correctly. And if I test that again, I could also see it stopping because I'm controlling the start and stop from the functions linked to the mouse events. But if I click on reset, this isn't currently changing. So what I want to do in reset is to set the timer text back to its original value. But if I test that out, it's not going to work properly still. If I now go stop and reset, it's gone back to 0. But notice my seconds are still on 58, my minutes are still on 9. It's going to carry on from 9:58. So I have to put seconds back to 0, minutes back to 0. I'm going to set these ones to be 0 initially as well. And now when I use my reset, it should go back to the beginning, and it is doing. For completeness, let's see what happens if I click on start and reset without pressing stop, and it just stops. So that timer is working now. I'll just go over briefly how it works again. So I've set up on my stage some text which I've given an instance name, and 3 buttons which I've also given instance names. To the buttons I've added mouse event listeners, and those functions are controlling whether the timer is started, stopped or reset. The timer I've set up here, I've given it a delay of 1000 milliseconds, and it's going to cycle in perpetuity. So when I click on the start button, because I've added an event listener, to listen for timer events on the timer that I've created. This timer function will start to be executed every second, and that increments this seconds value. I've declared the seconds and the minutes up there. If seconds reaches 60, seconds is reset, minutes is incremented. We've got a trace that shows that. And then I need to format the minutes and seconds in such a way that it can be displayed on the stage in the timer text. So I've used a timer string to gradually build up the formatting. I'm using is minutes less than 10 to find out if I need a leading 0 or not. And then for the seconds, I'm adding on the seconds part to the timer string to create the full timer string, including the minutes and the seconds. And then I'm using the timer string to set the text property of the timer text on the stage. So that's happening every second after I've clicked on start. If I click on stop, that stops happening. If I click on reset, the timer text on the stage is reset to 0, seconds and minutes are set to 0, and the timer is reset, ready to start again. So that's how you would set up a timer. I've added the same code to the guess the number. I'm not going to go through that in this lesson, but if you want to have a look at the code, there'll be some code that you can look at associated with this lesson. And we're going to be continuing with ActionScript over the next few lessons, learning more techniques and aspects of ActionScript, and then we'll be looking at another project which will tie together everything we've done so far.